Hello, I'm Ramsey Burt from De Montfort University, and this is an introductory video for the series of seminars that Tanya at Vaganova Academy and myself are organising with the support of the British Council Moscow, their UK-Russia Creative Bridge project. The topic that Tanya and I have come up with for these seminars is how theoretical perspectives can offer new insights into existing artistic practices and allow artists to see these differently and find new potentials for innovation. Practice-based research in dance seeks to make an original contribution to knowledge. One way of looking at this, what I'm going to talk about in this introduction, is that this is research into what the body can do. In his Ethics, Spinoza wrote that no one has hitherto determined what the body can do. And Gilles Deleuze has commented on this, rephrasing it as, what can a body do? Qu'est-ce que peut un corps? We can never know in advance what a body can do. We never know how we're organised and how the modes of existence are enveloped in somebody. To do practice-based research in dance and make an original contribution to knowledge, we need to accept that we don't know everything about what the body can do, and believe that there's always something more to discover. So I think that's what doing research, practice-based research, as opposed to just creating new work, is about. You might argue against this that the human body has its limitations. In ballet, for example, a ballerina can't do more than 32 fouettes. Can't exceed what Pierina Legnani achieved in Petitpas Cinderella in 1893. Another example will be in the circus, and I don't know exactly what the details are, but there are certain kind of feats that people do on the flying trapeze, a certain number of triple somersaults with barrel rolls or something. And these kind of feats, again, were all achieved by the end of the 19th century, and nobody's been able to go further than that. So you might say, well, we do know what the body can do, that this is all they can do. The problem with this is that it seeks to see the dancer's body, or the trapeze artist's body, in quantitative terms. How many somersaults or how many fouettes. Now, of course, there are some kinds of physical limitations, and I will come back to that later. But I think that this is limiting, closing down our ideas about what the body can do, saying we do know what the body can do, this is all it can do. Well, one thing would be to observe that our bodies are different from people's bodies in the 1890s. So my grandfather was born in the 1870s, and I was born in 1953, so I can just about remember him. I think he died when I was 3 or 4. What I do remember was that he was really quite small. Improvements in medicine, hygiene, diet, particularly diet for young children, medical care, all sorts of things that have changed since then, which by and large mean that we are healthier, we're taller, we're stronger, and we live longer than people did at the time that these ballet and circus feats were achieved. So why am I talking about the body when it's dualistic to talk about it as if it were separate from the mind, rather than forming what F.M. Alexander calls psychophysical unity. The problem is that we're too often told that thinking, intelligence, intellectual activity are things that only take place in our heads, and that in comparison what the body can do is not valued. In the UK in the 1990s, when people started doing practice-based PhDs in dance, too often they were asked to write a thesis that was the same length as somebody who was doing a PhD in literature or history, and then also doing an hour's worth of choreography on top. So that in some ways it's like the university couldn't accept that there was originality in the choreography. They could only recognise it in the writing. So they were actually asking people doing practice-based PhDs to do twice as much work as somebody doing a more conventional scholarly PhD. Nowadays, generally people write, say, half the length of a scholarly PhD as some kind of evaluation or contextualization, and say 50,000 words, and then the equivalent in practice. I noted earlier that there are always limitations to what the body can do. This is something that Brian Massumi has discussed in a 2003 interview titled Navigating Movement. In this, Massumi talks about walking as controlled falling. Massumi says that walking as controlled falling is something of a proverb. It conveys the sense that freedom, or the ability to move forward and to transit through life, isn't necessarily about escaping from constraints. There are always constraints. When we walk, we're dealing with the constraint of gravity. There's also the constraint of balance and a need for equilibrium. But at the same time, to walk, you need to throw off the equilibrium. You have to let yourself go into a fall and then cut it off and regain your balance. You move forward by playing with the constraints, not avoiding them. There's an openness of movement, even though there's no escaping constraints. So, to say that 32 fouettes is the limit of what the body can do is to close down the potential for movement. Spinoza, Deleuze and Massumi are in effect opening dance up as a field in which there are always new potentialities. Because I'm a dance historian, I want to finish with an example that illustrates the way that what the body can do is always historically, socially and politically specific. There's a moment in Trisha Brown's 1983 piece Set and Reset, beautifully caught in this photograph by Jack Mitchell, where the two men in the original cast, Stephen Petronio and Randy Warshaw, have a seemingly spontaneous collision. Both are dancing separately when Warshaw jumps powerfully and Petronio intercepts him in midair, using their combined momentum to change the directions that they're each going in. This is a piece that builds on research into new ways of moving that Brown had been doing on her own, and then with her company, which was all female dancers, all women, since about the mid-70s. So it's about 7 or 8 years worth of research. And then in Set and Reset, for the first time, she had two men in the company, Warshaw and Petronio. So because she's working for the first time with male dancers, Brown is in effect finding out what the male body can do. In an interview, she said that she was aware that sometimes a sort of non-binary, she didn't use that term, I think I think a kind of unisex style of moving was undignified to the male body. So creating movement that was the same for both men and women kind of limited men, and she didn't want to do that. She wanted to, as it were, find out what the male body could do. And I think that's what she's doing here, that she's creating a moment where, in the terms of her own choreography, she is finding out, how a kind of male strength and power and kind of heavier body can what they can do. So, if we look at the video again, they're all dancing the same material, though Diane Madden there is obviously much smaller than Stephen Petronio. And here's Trisha Brown. She's going to do in a moment an amazing kind of one-handed handstand and be caught. So they're all doing a movement that is really they're pushing themselves in their own way to the limits. They're really enjoying just doing what they do well. There's no attempt for them to try and be do things the same way. And so here's this moment, the catch. What they're doing could be really showing off, hypermasculine, macho, and quite threatening. And yet it's just one little incident in all of these different sort of collisions of between people, which makes it just they're the same as everybody else, but they're also different. That there's something singular. It recognises their singularity within a kind of multiplicity of differences, and I think that is really positive. It's a much easier way. It's a much more positive way of showing masculinity. One that comes from a kind of an openness towards kind of gender issues that must be in some way a product of the feminist movement. If you read about Set and Reset in Susan Rosenberg's excellent book on Trisha Brown, you'll find details about the way that money was raised from theatres and dance festivals that made it possible for Brown to create this dance work with a commissioned score from Laurie Anderson and commissioned costumes and set from the painter Robert Rauschenberg, and spending a lot of time in the studio with, for her, quite a large company of dancers actually making the piece. So most of the dance institutions in the United States receive financial subsidy from local governments, local states, or the federal government as a whole, through organisations such as the National Endowment for the Arts and other organisations like that. So what Brown and her dancers bodies could do was determined in part on the ideas that politicians have about what is suitable to receive public money. It's also dependent on what theatres decide that their regular audiences would be likely to buy tickets and come to see. So a work like Set and Reset only exists when an audience witnesses it and responds to what the dancers' bodies can do. Ian McIntosh argues that although energy flows chiefly from performer to audience, the performer is rendered impotent unless he or she receives in return a charge from the audience. He's actually writing about architecture and audience, and how the design of the theatre can facilitate this two-way exchange between the performers doing something, the audience responding to it, and giving the dancers permission to go on doing what they're doing. So he goes on to say the energy must flow both ways, so that the two forces fuse together to create an ecstasy. Well, that's what he says. But what the body can do is always what potentials emerge from connections between people, whether it is the connection between Petroni and Warshaw in the moment from that moment of video I've just shown, or on stage during a performance of Set and Reset, or between the dancers and the audience during a performance. And this being in the audience and seeing something and knowing that I'm surrounded by other people who are seeing this and are feeling excited or interested or moved by what is happening on stage, that is something I am really missing, and I'm sure we all are during this social distancing due to the coronavirus. So I said at the beginning that theoretical perspectives can give new insights into artistic practices and thus open up new potentials for innovation. And by discussing what the body can do, I've talked about the bodily, social and cultural, economic, political and institutional factors that at a particular moment in time frame what the body can do. I mentioned Brown Massumi's point that while there's no escaping constraints, you move forward by playing with them. Dance practice is part of its social and historical context, constrained by that context, playing with these constraints, but also sometimes helping to redefine and change its context. As Deleuze puts it, we never know in advance what the body can do, what we can do as people. But that's how we move forward and discover new potentials that move us in new ways. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in the online seminars.